Good day. In this day, I'm going to talk about how to avoid wasting your time preparing job interviews. Okay, the first scenario is the typology of candidate who obsessively prepares to fit into a company's culture, okay, or company's cultural attributes or a company's leadership principles, if you want, in Amazon terms, right? So basically, what I'm referring to is to candidates who believe that if you're able to fit into all the 16 Amazon leadership principles, you'll be able to pass screening rounds and final interview rounds with Amazon. When in fact, those are just, some guiding principles that, yes, they do in job interviews, but from here to obsess on fitting the company's culture to pass their interviews, it's a strategy that rarely, if at all, works. The reason for this is because many people will try to fit into those behaviors rather than focusing on how their stories can sell themselves as better and the most qualified candidates, which is often, what they're actually looking for in screening rounds, right? Now, this isn't to say that those core values are useless. No, in fact, I sell training programs based on those core values, but that's a methodology to build your behavioral interviewing skills, which might take weeks to months, even longer in some cases. So you should understand precisely the context, what you're preparing for. If you're preparing for a screening round, then they're just interested to see whether you might be a great fit for them. If you're preparing for a final interview round and they call you on short notice, again, it makes no sense to obsess on those 16 leadership principles at Amazon. However, if you want to start early on in the process and become good with behavior interviewing skills, yes, you may employ such a process, which, by the way, has some great results, but understand the context that you're in. The second thing I'd like to talk about here would be candidates focusing on stuff such as storytelling or polishing up their English speaking skills or buying an HD webcam and an expensive microphone, basically trying to impress on the occasion on the cosmetics. Okay, what I can tell you, and I'm doing this for around 7 years, is that it never worked to focus on these types of cosmetics and trying to impress them these ways. And nowadays it's even less so now with the generalization of AI, when everyone tries to impress with their AI rewarded answers, right? What I would suggest instead, to go back on trying to impress them by the quality of the idea you want to communicate, because most of you will be surprised how many candidates are unintelligible in this job interviews. Okay, the third thing you should keep in mind here is the job description. Okay, so the job description, many of you consider it as it's a golden mine to predict the types of questions, the type of qualifications they're gonna be interested in the ideal candidate. Okay, let me tell you just this. I used to run an applicant tracking system, and I used to develop job descriptions for a few hundred hiring managers we had, and the job descriptions I developed and I took from ONET, they used for 5 years with minimal, if at all, any modifications, right? So basically, if you're expecting them to put everything in the job description, you're not correct in your reasoning here. They will never tell you what they're actually looking for in the ideal candidate, because if they would, everyone would prepare just that, right? So basically, my point here is that to stop obsessing over the job description, which is nothing more than a marketing manifesto, read it a few times, take as an information, as a learning experience, and then move on. Okay. The fourth thing I like to talk about here would be candidates who have a tendency to prepare what they like versus what matters for them in job interviews. And the most common example is for introverted candidates. An introverted candidate will be 10 times more likely to be working on their story bank than to role play. Okay, and to put it to an extreme, there's many candidates who prepare a story bank for 2 weeks, 1 month on end, and then the first time they role play that story bank is during the job interview. Okay, so needless to say, the results will not be what they expect them to be, right? Or vice versa. I observe that people who like to role play too much, people who are really good with behavioral interests but still role play, might benefit a lot more from preparing their story banks and prepare the theoretical part rather than the storytelling, right? So if you have this issue, you should understand that there's two things that basically matter to become good with behavioral interviews: story banks and role play, but you cannot do one without the other. Okay, so it must be a combination of these two elements, and whenever you feel like you're obsessing too much over one, you should seriously consider the other, right? And maybe one more here, your tell me about yourself. Okay, people overspend time on their tell me about yourself on the reason that the first impression is the last impression in these job interviews, which in my experience is rarely the case with high quality interviews. So this has become such a problem to the extent that I recommend people to memorize their tell me about yourself simply in a bit to move on, to move on to other stuff that's a lot more valuable for them to pass job interviews. Because if you memorize your tell me about yourself, a version that you're happy with it, you can also quantify the amount of time you spent, and then you could say, hey, yes, I've done this, let's move on. You will also gain a bit more motivation these ways, right? So as you can see, there's plenty of ways you could optimize the time spent in interview prep. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.